Okay, it says we're live. It says we're live. This is it. This is it. YouTube live. Hello, hello. Welcome to my first ever live stream. I think I couldn't get on basically for a moment just then because I had a VPN on my laptop. Anyway, you don't need to know about that. Well, hello to YouTube. My name is Tom. Welcome back to back to my house, back to my office, to the northeast of England, and welcome to my first ever YouTube live. This is a little bit of an experiment. It's an experiment to see whether there's an appetite or a need for some discussion around how we respond to the climate crisis, maybe need for some questions and some explanation. Because there's a lot of noise in this world. There's a lot of noise in the conversation around decarbonisation and the climate emergency. There's a lot competing for your attention, and there's a lot of confusion, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. There is fear, there is uncertainty, there is doubts, there is delay, as my friend Gary, who's with us tonight from EV Musings, might say. So, how do we see the wood through the tree planting? Where do we get our answers to all our questions, our worries, our doubts, our concerns? How do we prioritize action? And how do we move away from emissions as a society as soon as possible? Well, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to answer some of those questions this evening. Please do type any questions you have in the chat and I'll respond to them as soon as I can. And if there aren't any questions, maybe I'll just spend some time talking through what my strategy is for reducing emissions in our homes, in our communities, in organizations around us, in neighborhoods, and in the regions that we live in. I'm going to be here for the next little while. Grab a chair, grab a drink, think of a question, and ask me anything. So let's start with, so Gary from EV Musings has asked us, talk to us about aviation, the role of things like offsets and your dilemma between balancing reducing emissions with relatives abroad, please. Well, yeah, that's a good question. And that's actually something that we talked about on Gary's podcast, EV Musings, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, how do we shape this? How do we respond to the climate emergency and get flying right? Should we fly? Can we fly? Can we fly and offset our emissions? All this kind of stuff. Well, ultimately, aviation is a high emissions thing. Flying all around the world is difficult. I have family who live in the States. I have a brother-in-law who is American, a sister-in-law who is American, and I actually have another brother-in-law who is a pilot. So this is really relevant to me. So should we be flying? It's a tricky one. I think that my first response is that there are actually a small number of people that are responsible for the majority of emissions that is linked to the aviation world. And yeah, we need to really reduce that. So we need to be really sensitive about the flights that we take. We need to think long and hard when we're going to fly, and we need to save up for that, save up those emissions in case we, for when we need to fly. We shouldn't be flying willy-nilly. We shouldn't be flying just for every weekend or transatlantic as often as we could or whatever it would be. We should be taking care with flying. But then and instead of flying, we should be trying to move down the chain of transport. So we should be trying to use that, to use trains, trying to use buses, trying to use public transport where we can. We should be avoiding flying, particularly domestically. We should be avoiding flying as much as we can in Europe, and we could use the things there. But when we do have to fly, I think that it's not a bad thing to try and count our emissions. And this is part of my strategy, but count the impact we've had and try and do our best to respond to it to some extent. If we understand the impact that we're having, then maybe we can do something about it. And we could look into that world of offsetting, or but that is kind of a murky world. Can we plant our way through our emissions linked to flying? I'm not sure we can. But yeah, if we've flown, if we feel we have to fly, if we're taking that once a year or once every few years trip, then being able to invest something in tree planting, being able to invest something in clean energy, paying someone to invest something in those areas, I think is a good thing. More money in that world is positive. So great question. I think that's probably that's one of my more difficult questions. I really struggle with that. I don't fly very often, and when I do, I try to count the cost, and I try to make sure that I am putting my money where my mouth is. I've got a video on YouTube about that. I think it's called Low Carbon Confessions. Please do have a look. So let's just take a step back. And why am I able to respond to this stuff? Why am I able to answer any questions? Why am I qualified at all to say anything about this story? Well, I'm a chartered mechanical engineer. I've got experience working on low carbon building design. I'm also a chartered environmentalist, which is an accreditation that means other professional engineers and environmentalists think I'm worthy of a title like that. And I work my day job on developing projects to reduce emissions in the area that I live. Everything from installing heat pumps at leisure centres, offices, libraries and schools, to installing solar panels on roofs or in fields, to installing electric vehicle chargers, to getting the best efficiency as I can out of systems in buildings, and then provoking change in the communities around me. So I live, I drink, I breathe this stuff. And I spend my waking hours and some of my sleeping hours chewing over how best to respond. And I think I have a strategy for decarbonisation that people may find helpful and relevant. So I hope that gives you some context. So please do share some more thoughts and say hello. Second questions come in. Gary obviously knows me a little bit more than many of you do. He says, as a mechanical engineer, where do you stand on the question, can we truly reach 100% renewables without needing a backup of some fossil fuel power plant somewhere? Well, I think that's a really good question. And it's probably perfection being the enemy of progress, or perfection being the enemy of good. This week, we don't have much wind, we don't have much sun, and we are reliant on burning something to generate our electricity at the moment. Over a year, we have something like 40% of our energy come from wind or solar. So that's a huge contribution to how we get our energy. But there are moments when we can't get all our we can't have all our electricity from renewable sources. One day, when we are able to build much more in terms of our renewable capacity, we will have much more opportunity to get most of our energy from wind or from solar or from other renewable sources. And the point that I guess is being made here is that we're not going to be able to get 100%. Weeks like this, where it's still and where it's not sunny, we're going to need some other source of electricity. And I think it's okay in a very low carbon society to still use some thermal energy, thermal power plants, where we might burn something to generate that, at least for the foreseeable future. I think we need to be moving away as much as we can from that, but I think we need the reality is that having an energy mix means that we can move to a lower carbon system. Andrew Crossland, who's the guy behind My Grid GB, he's put kind of a manifesto of how we'd get to a very low carbon electricity system. He talks through how much storage we'd need, how much nuclear power we'd need, how much wind, solar, hydro, all this kind of stuff. And he has his manifesto running on his website 24/7, which is trying to answer that question: what would our electricity system in the UK look like if we're trying to get to a very low carbon system? So eventually, at some point in the next 30 years, I think we could get to a place where we have almost zero emissions on our electricity grid. And that's through several different things. That's interconnectors with Europe. That's through energy storage in the form of batteries, or in the form of some kind of pump storage, or some kind of storage like that. It's also demand shifting, so moving when we need to charge things like electric vehicles, and they might have one of the forms of storage in their batteries, and all those different solutions, which means that if it's not windy and sunny in the UK, it may well be windy in somewhere else in Europe. It may well be sunny somewhere else in Europe, and we can share electricity around a large grid. It's a big engineering challenge, and the question: can we truly reach 100% renewables without needing some kind of backup fossil fuel power plant somewhere? Yes, one day we can. We must. But it's probably a long way away, and it's a big engineering challenge. Okay, hello to Lewis. Great to have you here. He's said inertia on electric grids can be supplied by thermal sources, gas and coal, etc. Can also be supplied by flywheels. Wind turbines spin. Why can't they do this function if spinning at the right frequency? Oh, you're really pushing me here to go back to my fourth year engineering classes. I think the frequency response in generating electricity is basically the mass in what's spinning in a gas turbine at the moment, for example, and we don't have that same spinning mass in wind. There is frequency capability in things like battery storage and other things like that, but wind, just because wind's spinning doesn't mean that can provide a service in terms of inertia and the frequency response that's needed on the grid. I think that's probably because there's not enough stored energy in, I guess, rotational energy in a wind turbine compared to what would be the mass of the inertia of a constantly spinning turbine. Well, that's way too technical for this, I need to get my engineering notes out from my university degree. I'm not a power engineer. I don't work in power plants. But yeah, it's an interesting problem. And I think, there's multiple things going on in the electricity grid, and supply is not just one of them. So having the right number of kilowatts on the system is not the only problem. Serving the voltage at the right frequency, at the right voltage, and a lot of other issues that electrical engineers can come in and tell me more about need to be fixed with that kind of thing. So, yes. Let's just have a little think as more questions come in, and thank you so much for questions. Let's just have a little think about where we're up to in terms of climate change. Where do we begin? Let's start with some facts. Where are we up to with the climate change story? Well, today, the average temperature is about 1.1 degrees higher than it was in Victorian times. This means that the world has changed. Habitat for wildlife has changed. Plants grow in different locations. They flower at different times. Our agriculture and our cultivation of crops is different. Parts of our world are less habitable for humans. Glaciers have retreated. Ice has melted. Oceans are warmer. The weather has become more extreme. Storms are stronger and more regular, and we live in a different world to the generations before us. And all of this, we are certain, has been caused by an increase in the concentration of heat-trapping gases that humans have emitted since those Victorian times, and the most important of those being carbon dioxide and methane. There's now 50% more CO2 and 60% more methane in the atmosphere than there was in the 19th century. In this year, the world has experienced weather that breaks records. So 8 of the hottest 10 years ever recorded have been in the last 8 years. We've seen extreme heat in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Europe, in North America, and of course we saw extreme heat in the UK, where it went over 40 degrees. We've seen wildfires within the Arctic Circle and in Australia. We've seen massive floods in India and in Pakistan. And we've seen impacts of that kind, and in many ways, we kind of become numb to those impacts and what they mean. Whether it's heat, storms, flooding, crop failure, or all the other impacts that climate change could be responsible for, each of them is impacting human beings. So back to some questions. Chinook asks, how important do you think the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere is? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think there's a get out of jail free card to emissions if we have a technology that can remove CO2. And there are technologies like direct air capture or tree planting that can be responsible for removing CO2. I think we need to get to our emissions as low as we can. And then if we have those technologies at scale, we need to deploy them where we can. But those technologies aren't a get out of jail free card to emit more. It's not something that I would focus on, to be honest. I think it's a bonus if we can remove CO2 without much energy and without much cost. That's fantastic, but we need to be focusing our efforts elsewhere. And then Gary's also asked, looping back to demand response, what are your thoughts around the saving sessions that are going on across the grid? Is this the right thing to do? So I took part in a saving session again today from Octopus Energy. This is where a energy company, and actually the national grid, is asking energy companies to reduce demand so that they can, so that we can keep the lights on ultimately, but so we can reduce cost and we can reduce the peaks of demand. I think it's a great thing. That kind of demand response stuff has existed for a long time in industry. So big energy users will be on the end of a phone call to the national grid, and who might say, okay, we're struggling a little bit at the moment. Would you reduce your demand a little bit? And they might turn off a large bit of plant, or they might turn something down. And that through the saving session stuff, that's happening on a domestic level as well. And I think that I remember the first saving session, Octopus Energy, I think it was 108 megawatts or 208 megawatts worth of power that was reduced for an hour. So 208 megawatt hours of energy. That's really meaningful. That's a really significant amount of energy that we as Octopus Energy customers said, okay, yeah, we could do this. We can move when we cook our dinner, or we can reduce the set point on our heat pumps, or we could unplug things to charge, or we could do things, not charge electric vehicles at that time, which means that everyone benefits. Not having that peak as high means we don't have to use as much, whether it's fossil fuel plants or other. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely got a place. I think the kind of hashtag saving sessions is going to run out a little bit eventually, and we're going to lose interest. But I think that it's a positive step to take to be able to be flexible with our own energy use, and to have someone centrally ask us when to be flexible. I would say an hour. I'm not sure an hour is sufficient. Maybe that's if they're able to split us into 3 groups that we're going to take part in the saving sessions. That might be better. But ultimately what might happen, so today I turned my heat pump down between 5 and 6, and I put off cooking dinner until 6. But I imagine that if everyone did that, then all of a sudden there's a big demand to turn a heat pump back on again at 6 o'clock. And there might be a demand as ovens turn on, or hobs turn on, or kettles boil after 6 o'clock. And so if we've just shifted the demand and actually made a bigger peak as the saving session ends, there's an issue there. So it'll be really interesting to see. I do think that there's a claim that we've saved certain amounts of CO2, which I think is a bit dubious, but there's probably some electricity that we've turned off. I realized today that I've not turned on a few plugs from the last saving session. So the small amount of energy that they might have been using to have a smart speaker on in the office that I hadn't had on for a week, that stuff is positive. So but I think it builds a point on what could happen if we all do things together at the same time. So how do we aggregate impact, whether it's marginal gains or all of us just changing things slightly, having a big benefit across the whole of society. So I think central control of our energy system is really important for a low carbon future. So we talked about where we're up to. What do the scientists say about what I said earlier about where we're up to? So Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer, and a familiar name to many of us over the last 2 years because of the pandemic, said that in his briefing to the MPs in the summer that we've had 2.5 years of a global crisis in the form of a pandemic. We face 50 years of really big problems relating to climate. And the nature of that threat to countries all around the world means that this has to be one of the things that is absolutely on every government's agenda. There's no way that we can ignore it. So the modelling suggests that unless we have drastic action in the coming years, we'll see an average temperature moving past 1.5 degrees and towards 2 degrees of warming. And all the extremes that we already see at 1.1 degrees will become more regular, more dramatic, and more deadly. And let's be clear that this really is coming, that 1.5 degrees, even meeting the Paris Agreement, is a disaster for millions, if not billions of people. And even with drastic action, even with halving emissions by 2030, even with net zero by 2050, the generation after us will live a much more precarious life with more displaced people, more concerns about fresh water, more extreme weather, and more crop failure. And all this is because humans have dug up, processed, and burnt fossil fuels for the last 200 years. And it's that simple. Millions of years of deposited organic matter burnt in decades. It's pretty dire, isn't it? So that's where we're up to. How do we respond? And we'll just jump back onto another question, and then I might go back to how we might respond. So Gary asks, what are your thoughts on companies like Ørsted, who have installed one of the largest wind farms in the North Sea, but most of the generation is going towards powering an oil drilling platform? Is this the right thing to do? Okay, yeah, I don't know that specific example. Yeah, let's just talk about Ørsted a little bit. So Ørsted, I think, are a mainly state-owned energy company from Denmark. They were Dong Energy. Dong makes me laugh. But they were Dong Energy, which was Danish oil and natural gas, or the Danish version of those words. And they transitioned to Ørsted as they sold all their oil and gas assets and focused on renewables. So building renewable generation to power a demand, any demand, I think is a positive thing. It means that we're not burning something to power a demand. I don't know of the example that you're quoting there of a large wind farm powering an oil drilling platform. That doesn't sound great, but I'd say an oil drilling platform is probably a better, a wind turbine powering an oil drilling platform rather than a diesel generator powering that platform is a better thing to do. But it's complicated. We live in this complicated energy system with an awful lot of variables. More wind power in whatever way it's needed is a positive thing. Lewis has come back and he says, I've just been reading Greta's new book. She thinks we don't, as a population, know how far the changes need to go to meet our obligations or how systematic and quick it needs to happen. What do you think about general population awareness of the severity of the crisis? This is a really interesting one, isn't it? It's been interesting to watch the last few years with organisations declaring climate emergencies, with the net zero legislation from a Conservative government, which is kind of extraordinary, with school strikes, with Greta's campaigns, with Fridays for the Future, where hundreds and thousands of young people said, you know what, we want to see some change, and that phrase, a climate emergency. I think as a society, we all kind of sat back and went, great, yeah, there's something changed here, a net zero target. Okay, this is going to be okay. We're going to sort things out. One of the points that I make is that net zero by 2050 is way too late. And I come back to the IPCC report that says that we need a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And actually that 50% is from whenever you start saying it. Whether it was in 2018, 2019, or today, we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, and that's a massive challenge. And I don't think society is ready for for how big the change needs to be. So if we're reducing 50% of all our emissions, that means halving the number of miles driven in a fossil fuel vehicle. Actually, probably more than halving the number of miles driven in a fossil fuel vehicle. It doesn't necessarily mean putting those miles into an electric vehicle, because there's still emissions linked to the electricity grid. It also means, transforming our electricity systems, building new wind turbines, solar farms, storage we talked about previously. In County Durham, where I live, in the last year, there's been 3 50 megawatt or 49.9 megawatt solar farms that have been not granted planning permission in County Durham because of local, I guess, NIMBYism and concerns around what a big industrial site like a solar farm might do to the fields around them. And then actually if in County Durham again, 50% of our emissions come from our heat, are we going to reduce that by half in the next 8 years? Whether it's by insulating properly or ripping out gas boilers and installing heat pumps, is it possible? So the 200,000 homes in County Durham, could we install 100,000 heat pumps in the next 8 years? We're nowhere near that as a concept. And then heat pumps still have emissions because there's emissions linked to the grid. We've not built enough solar farms. We've not built enough wind turbines. So this is a big issue. Are we willing to make drastic changes in our lives? Do we understand the scale of the challenge? Are we ready to do that kind of thing? And yeah, I think Greta is a really good example. She speaks so well on, first of all, on that the first climate emergency declaration wave, where Greta was so clear that this needs to change. We need to do something seriously. But increasingly, as her profile has risen, she's now saying, actually, no, you're still not getting this. You're still not responding correctly. And I think she's such a good voice in that stuff. But and actually, as we see, yeah, I mean, the Just Off Boil guys are just so simply right. That a lot of what they're saying isn't asking for much. It's just stop oil. Don't grant new oil licenses in UK waters. That's not a hard question. Insulate Britain. Let's have funding available so we can insulate our homes properly. And these aren't even drastic asks. They might be doing drastic things to provoke that the cause, but they're not drastic asks. They're simple asks which we should all be on board with. So, are we ready? Do we think, as a population, we have awareness of the severity of the crisis? Are we ready for the drastic changes to meet our obligations? I think absolutely nowhere near. And even those organisations that declare climate emergencies, I think it's some people maybe at the top of organisations or some people within organisations, but has it filtered through a whole organisation to drastically change everything it does? I don't think we can say that. So, yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't think we're anywhere near having the right answer. So Lewis has come back with another question. Lots of new housing estates near me in Durham and me and Lewis in Newcastle and the Greenbelt are heated by gas or roofs with no PV. It's enraging. I completely agree. Yeah, whether this was kind of political gamesmanship or not, but the Labour government pre-2010 had a net zero homes policy for 2016. So I asked whether it's political gamesmanship because, yeah, it was probably put so far in the distance that it was probably going to be another government that was responsible for it. It turns out it was, whether it's coalition or Conservative government. And through lobbying, maybe right decision, but that net zero home standard was removed. And we didn't really see a change to building regs for much of the last 10 years. Recently, the government consulted on the future home standard and then has suggested that by 2025 legislation will change so that all homes are built with, I think it's with an increase into their thermal properties with solar panels and with a heat pump and without a gas connection. So 2025, we're almost there. We're almost in a good place. I think the consultation said this would be responsible for something like a 32% reduction in emissions of new buildings. This is positive. It's not necessarily drastic, but it's 2025, and that was probably at least 3 years after the future home standard was announced. If their target of building 300,000 homes per year is going to be met, they're building about 1 million homes, not to the future home standard, or that's the targets for England and Wales, or maybe England, but yeah, let's say England and Wales. So there's another 1 million homes being built that are not future home standard. They're the past, and they have gas connections, and they aren't built with solar panels. You're exactly right, Lewis. And they're probably actually built poorly, so that they're leaky, inefficient homes that with boilers that are way too big that all cost lots to run. And this isn't good enough. So what could we do? I think developers have got a lot to answer for on this stuff. There was a report that the Committee on Climate Change did a few years ago that had a reference in it. I'll get the figures wrong, but it said something like it would cost of a new build from today, it would cost around £25,000 to upgrade to near passive house standards, and it would have cost £5,000 extra to build it at that standard with, from day one. And yeah, I'll get the figures wrong, but of the homes that in that year that were built by Persimmon Homes, if you multiplied £5,000 by the number of homes they built, it was just a little bit more than the bonus that the chief exec of Persimmon Homes was paid. So instead of building high quality homes that would have a future in the UK, Persimmon decided to pay their chief exec something like £96 million worth of bonus. So the developers got a lot to answer for. These mass home builders that could do something repeatable, could learn lessons and build quality, whether that is through modern methods of construction, or just through repeatable, high-skilled labour. They should be doing more. They should be doing more. And I think, as a society, I know in County Durham, there's a big kind of campaign about getting the best out of a 1,500 home development. I think it's 1,500, maybe 1,000 home development that's just outside Durham City, and that's asking for a lot of this stuff, whether it's solar PV, heat pumps, or a low carbon form of heat. I would say that sometimes campaigns are so scattergun. They say they kind of ask for everything, which means they get nothing. So in lobbying local authorities or in lobbying developers, this particular example had something like a 10-point list of things that they wanted to achieve, and some of which were contradictory. So it's tricky. It's tricky to get right. But we need to be simple. And this comes back to one of my strategies for decarbonising things is we need to be simple with this stuff. And we'll get onto what that strategy could be. So if we're going to reduce emissions by half by 2030 to meet our obligations, we need to be drastic. And I think that to be drastic, we need to have a plan. And I'd ask the few of you that are on the call, on the stream today, do you have a plan to reduce your emissions by half by 2030? What is that plan? My plan, and the thing that I think could be applied to individuals, wider communities, businesses, public sector organizations, non-profits, and everything in between, is a 5-step plan to deal with emissions. Because when we have a plan that we can share with others, that we can be accountable for, we can make the steps that we need to carry through. So what's my plan? It's 5 points. Number 1 is count. Number 2 is prioritize. Number 3 is plan to make a plan. Number 4 is action. And number 5 is talk about it. Okay. So number 1, count our emissions. I think we need to know what our emissions are in order to tackle them, so that we're not wasting our resources and our time for marginal gain. And roughly in the UK, we can split emissions that we're directly responsible for into electricity, the emissions linked to electricity, the emissions linked to heat, transport, and the things that we consume. And there are loads of tools on the internet that you could use to understand exactly how your emissions are distributed. We could go into detail and we could account for every tiny bit. But if we wanted to be quick and we wanted to do a quick check, we could use a rule of thumb. And I'd encourage you to try this. So every kilowatt hour of electricity that you use, every kilowatt hour of natural gas you burn, and every mile you drive, and every mile you fly actually will emit about 250 grams of CO2. So tonight you could dig out your gas electricity bills. You could estimate where your main emissions are. You could dig out those bills. You could have a guess of how far you've driven or flown. You could use a rule of thumb and you could come to a total emissions for you, for your household, or for your community. Obviously, the things that we consume, it gets a bit more complex, whether it's food miles, the way food is made, where things are manufactured. It's difficult to count, and I don't think there's a rule of thumb. But to begin with, I think we need to be more knowledgeable about the systems of things we consume, knowledgeable of supply chains. We need to be part of a food system, not just consume from it. And we need to have we could have a plan for all that I'll come to later. But if we've counted where our emissions could be, if that's heat, electricity, transport, or the things we consume, we then can prioritize how we're going to tackle them. When we can see what proportion of our emissions is linked to each area, we can begin to prioritize. So step 2 in my plan is to prioritize. Now that we've counted our emissions, we can prioritize our action. When I did this exercise a few years back, I was amazed how much my gas boiler emitted. That little white box that we've all got in our homes. I thought that we were being frugal, and Esther, my wife, will tell you we're being very frugal, shivering under blankets each night, barely heating our house, but we still used 12,000 kilowatt hours of natural gas in 2020. That was responsible for 2.5 tons of CO2, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot, but when you multiply that by 20 million homes, it is a lot. And I'll admit that we weren't even that comfortable in our house. So as we said, I live in County Durham. Almost half of the emissions in County Durham are linked to gas and other fuels that we burn for heat. So for you, the biggest chunk of your emissions could be heat. It could be the way you get around, if it's in a private car on your own. Whatever it is, we need to make a plan to reduce it. And what needs to be done to reduce your emissions from travel or electricity use or heating system by half by 2030. There will be a way for us all to do it, but what is that way? So my third point in my 5-step plan is to make a plan. And this actually probably comes with the most work. Planning to reduce our emissions could be a minefield. There are experts and commentators and YouTube streamers and businesses all vying for your attention. Many with a silver bullet to solve all your problems, some trying to maintain the status quo, or using your newfound priorities of the climate emergency as an opportunity to sell you something, to make a bit of profit out of you, and to lock you into their product or service. And navigating that world is hard. It needs some wisdom, and it probably needs some patience. But I do think there are some ways that we can keep it simple. So let's go back to those 4 target areas: electricity, heat, transport, and the things we consume. Electricity is kind of the easy one. The national grid is reducing emissions on our behalf without us even noticing all the time. And since 2008, every kilowatt hour that we use has reduced emissions by about 60%. As we built more offshore wind turbines, more solar farms, and we've done other changes to our system that have happened just on our behalf. And that's sometimes happened when it's sometimes been provoked by us deciding to buy renewable electricity from a renewable energy supplier. But as these things continue to develop, the emissions will improve across the grid without us really trying. But one action we could take to reduce emissions linked to electricity is to simply use less. And there are some things that we can do to improve efficiency. We should all have LEDs. Every light bulb should be an LED in our homes. When we replace white goods, when it breaks down, we should be looking for alternatives with low energy demands. And these are really good, no regret steps that we can take to reduce the amount of electricity that we use. And reducing electricity is really important because the system's set up in a way that every next kilowatt hour of generation capacity every next kilowatt of generation capacity tends to come from the next dirtier source. We only need to switch on the coal power plants if the cleaner and cheaper generators can't meet the load. And then if we're looking at a local level, we could plan to install solar panels on our own buildings, on our own homes. But as the grid continues to reduce in emissions, solar panels move away from being a purely sustainable choice, and they actually become a financial decision that could facilitate other steps, which in itself is pretty positive. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So that's electricity. Again, I don't think we need to worry too much about reducing our electricity emissions. Next up comes heat. And the first step that I'd like to take is just to question whether our existing setup is operating as efficiently as it can. You may as well get the best out of a system that is already in place. Actually, this is one of the first things you could do. If you stop watching this stream, you could just go away and do this now. And because I'm an engineer, let's get into some of the engineering. But many of our boilers are set to produce heat in radiators at 80 degrees C. This means that our rooms can heat up really quickly, means our boilers turn off very quickly. And in the hare and tortoise of sustainable living, switching a boiler on and off repeatedly is not good for its efficiency, and it's actually not good for its longevity. Slow and steady wins the race. And if your boiler was installed in the last 15 or 20 years, it's likely to be of a condensing type, and it's likely to have a quoted efficiency of above 97%. It only has that efficiency when the flow temperatures are turned down very low. If you look at the data sheet at 80 degrees that many of our boilers are set to, the efficiency could be as much as 10, 15, 20% lower than 97%. So if we can turn the flow temperature down, and the boiler will have a few knobs on the front, maybe a screen that will allow you to reduce the radiator temperature or flow temperature, you can eke out a little bit of efficiency and make sure your current system is operating as good as it can. But how low can you go? You're likely to still be comfortable even this time of year when we've had negative temperatures at a flow temperature of 60 or 65 degrees. You may be comfortable even lower. How low is up to you, and it's probably a little bit of trial and error. Ideally, you'd have it set up in a way that is what we call weather compensated. So at -5 outside, it would be a certain temperature, but at 10 degrees outside, where you still need some heat, it'll be a much lower temperature. But that would probably need a heating engineer to come and help you set that up. But as the weather gets colder, just check whether you're comfortable and as comfortable as you might previously been. And if not, if a certain room is too cool, then maybe change the time on your heating system for it to run longer. Or you could turn the temperature up a few degrees, but don't go back up to 80 degrees. Keep it as low as you can. And this is a good first step. You should do it. But playing around with boiler settings isn't going to reduce emissions. Is only going to reduce emissions linked to heat by maybe 5 or 10%. If we need to get half by 2030, what else do we need to do? Well, again, it comes back to using less. That's where we start with electricity. So what plans do we need to make to use less heat? Does it mean a strict maximum temperature on your thermostat, or a new catchphrase of put another jumper on? It might, but it might also mean making a plan to improve insulation, to reduce drafts, upgrade windows and doors. Think about drastic measures like insulating your floor. What else could you do to reduce the amount of heat you need to stay comfortable? What plans do you need to make to upgrade parts of your house? And unless you're employing a passive house consultant and performing a deep retrofit, which is a really good thing to do, by the way, if you can afford it, you're still going to need to heat some spaces. You'll probably need to use a gas boiler of some sort unless you plan to make the change. So what could that change be to get rid of a gas boiler? Well, the step that gets us a drastic change in emissions as soon as we do it would be to install a heat pump. And this takes some thought, and it definitely needs a plan. But let me first say categorically, despite what some newspapers say, a heat pump, sized correctly, with a well-installed system, can heat any home. This is a Victorian terrace. It's got some double glazing. It's got some loft insulation. It's got a little bit of a modern extension at the back, but it's heated by a heat pump. The more efficient a house is, i.e. when the insulation is better, the lower the flow temperature needs to be, and the more efficient a heat pump can be to run. And the cheaper it is to run, but they can work in any home. And the more efficient and cheaper a gas boiler would be to run as well, but they can work in any home. Okay, so let's make a plan for heat pumps. Let's go into this sub-plan within the 5-step plan, within the et cetera, et cetera. You need to be ready. Installing a heat pump, you likely need to be ready for some disruption. It's likely that you might need to upgrade some radiators, again, so a heat pump can run more efficiently. You may also need to find some space for a hot water tank. You may need to upgrade some pipe work that supplies some radiators, and all of this may cause some disruption. But so will the emissions that you're going to avoid if you make the change. Secondly, in our mini plan for heat pumps are going to cost money. Any drastic change to your emissions is likely to cost money. There's currently a scheme that will give a household £5,000 towards the cost of a heat pump. The scheme is limited in scope and time. I think it's 30,000 vouchers per year for 3 years. Flagship policy to reduce emissions linked to heat. Well done, government. But the idea is, I guess, behind the scheme that the costs will come down as the number of installations ramp up. And there will be schemes for many fuel-poor households that will be run via local authorities that would pay for a system without any cost. But if you do have a plan to install a heat pump in the next 12 months or in the next 2 or 3 years, we can begin to budget for that change. We can begin to budget for the cost of installing a heat pump. If you know you need to outlay in the next 5 years, how would you plan for it? Finally, on installing a heat pump, why don't you swat up on what you need to install what you need to talk to and install it about. And there are great resources online, whether it's on YouTube or on websites. So on YouTube, yeah, the Heat Geek channel is fantastic about how talking through how heat pumps work and how heat pumps should be installed. And their consumer series is really, really accessible as well. And then maybe try Googling the heating hub at the same time. There are other resources like the Energy Saving Trust that will have helpful hints too. And there's actually a new government website that uses data in your EPC, which is not necessarily always the most accurate. But anyway, it uses that data in EPC to give you a step-by-step guide to installing a heat pump. Search for check if a heat pump could be suitable for your home into a search engine. And when you have a plan, you need to find an installer that will do a good job. The place that we tend to say we should start with this stuff is to start with the Micro Generation Certification Scheme, or MCS, who will have a list of approved installers. Cheers, Lewis. You go and put the wee one to bed. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good evening. But yeah, if you've started with the MCS certified website, then that would be a good place to start. But I'd also recommend looking for what the YouTube and Twitter community call a Heat Geek approved installer. But yeah, get in touch with an installer, get a heat loss assessment from them for your home, get a quote for the works, and book it in. A heat pump is nearly your only option for a low carbon heating system. I say nearly because you might be in an area that could be supplied by a district heat network that would supply low carbon heat to you without much changes to your house. They're not very common at the moment, so let's not wait out for that. But there aren't really any other low carbon options for heat in buildings. But that's it. Okay, we have a plan to live in a well-insulated, efficient home with a plan for installing a heat pump. We've got a plan for electricity. We've got a plan for heat. What about transport? Well, if most of our transport is sat in the front seat of a private car, there is a lot that we can do. We just need to organize our day-to-day activities so that we're consciously avoiding the car. This could mean booking a train well in advance. This could mean using a bus within your town. This could mean getting a new bike or getting that old bike from the shared service. It could mean choosing to make a rule to walk or to scoot short distances. But we live in a system where for most of us, driving in a private car is a choice, and it's a choice to emit more for our own convenience. We need to make a plan about how we get around and then make the steps to move away from cars to reduce our emissions. Simple. There will be some of us that need a private car so we can get to the local shops safely, or we can travel to work, or we can travel to see friends and family. And our systems are often not set up to facilitate car-free lives. Where I live in County Durham, there are lots of areas that will be completely cut off without a car. But what can we do to reduce the miles driven? Well, I think we can coordinate with others more. We can share journeys. We can tell neighbours when you're driving to a certain area. We could coordinate with friends and colleagues who might be driving to a similar place. And those of us who operate with more than one car, I'd ask the question, do you need to? Is there a car club in the area that you could sign up for that second car? What does car sharing look like in your community? If there isn't a car sharing club, could you start one? And then finally, when we're sharing our resources, when we've avoided wasteful miles, when we've put our convenience second, we could move to electrify our transport by purchasing an electric vehicle. And yes, EVs are expensive, but so are most brand new vehicles. There is a secondhand EV market that will get bigger and better. But an electric vehicle will reduce emissions today for each mile by about 65% from a fossil fuel alternative. And so it isn't the first thing I'm asking you to do, but it's definitely a good step to reduce our emissions. But don't think that an EV is a perfect solution. They're costly to manufacture. They still use significant amounts of energy, but they're definitely a good step. And if you haven't driven an electric vehicle, what are you doing watching this? Go and try one out. You'll be surprised how fun they are to drive. Okay, now we've made that plan to electrify our heating with a heat pump, to electrify our transport with an electric bike or an electric car. All of a sudden, those solar panels that we made a plan to install when we think about electricity start providing free heat or free miles. You can't create your own natural gas or petrol unless you've got some kind of drilling equipment and some kind of fractional distillation refining process in your backyard. But you could use a solar panel that could give you very low cost power to stay warm or to power transport. This could facilitate reduction in emissions rather than directly reducing emissions. When we move to electrify everything, we begin to have a low cost and a low carbon future. And with the price of energy that we're all experiencing at the moment, which is really high and potentially going up even further, buying less electricity by generating your own could be beneficial to all of us. So finally, in my third step in my 5-step plan, we need to have a plan for food and the things that we consume and the things that we buy. Because when we're a conscious member of the food system, when we're a conscious member of the supply chain, we can make good, sustainable decisions to eat seasonally, eat locally, buy once, move away from meat, to watch our portion sizes, to avoid waste, to avoid fast fashion, all this kind of stuff. We need to be conscious about what we consume, and we need to plan to make changes in our everyday life. This stuff can be more difficult to quantify. So as an engineer, it starts to get a bit fuzzy for me. So in my life, I try to keep it simple. I have meat for a treat. I try to buy secondhand. I try to buy quality and buy once. I try to avoid buying new. Okay, so that's step 1 was count. Step 2 was prioritize. Step 3 was make a plan to do something about those emissions. And step 4 is to just do it. When we have a plan in place, we may come across some issues, some unknowns, but at least we know where we're heading. We may know what is needed, and we may just need to make that step away from fossil fuels. We may need to make a meaningful decision to burn less, and therefore we just need to put the plan into action. Making the step to actively cause some disruption at home or to spend a significant amount of money could be really daunting. And my hope is that because you prioritize the kind of action that you might want to take, and you've made a thorough plan in taking it, at this stage, you're ready and prepared to make the step. That is my 4th point on my 5-point plan for reducing our emissions. The 5th point is potentially one of the most important steps, and that is to share your experience, to tell others. With all this work we've put in, we need to think about multiplying our impact. And local communities can be a perfect forum to do this. Could you offer to do a tour of your well-insulated, warm, low-carbon home? Could you do a session at a local village hall or a local church or whatever it would be about the steps that you've taken? Could you develop a resource center or a little leaflet that could go to the houses on your street to share your experience and knowledge in your community? Could you signpost the people around you to the steps that we all need to take? It could be as little as telling others what you've achieved. Our neighbor who's currently getting solar panels and a heat pump in quite a big system put in, he actually asked our local Facebook group, when they have those residents Facebook groups, whether anyone would be interested in following their story. And a few people said yes. And our neighbor now has a Facebook message thread updating me and a few other people on their progress every week. It's brilliant. Okay, that's my 5-step action plan for reducing our emissions and to respond to the climate emergency. We start by counting. We then prioritize prioritize and focus our resources. We make a plan to reduce those emissions, and then we make the step to carry out that plan, and then we share our experience. I hope that could give some kind of framework for making changes in your life and making steps to your home, your everyday life, or your community more broadly. And I focused on those kind of actions because I think that often our focus is on the campaign, on changing big things or asking others to do more, on pointing out wrong in what other people do. And sometimes we just need to start with a splinter in our own eye and to make action ourselves. But when we think about multiplying our impact, those campaigns, whether it's Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or other things more broadly, whether it's calling on local leaders to do more and local authorities, or calling on national leaders to invest in, prioritize, and facilitate emissions reduction, those kind of actions are essential in changing the system. If 50 people watch this video and reduced emissions by 2/3 in the next year, that might save 250 tons of CO2. That's fantastic. But the UK emits 400 million tons of CO2 in 2020. And that was when we didn't do much as a society. So those campaigns run by those organizations like XR, Fridays for the Future, Greenpeace, Tear Fund, and all the others, they are so meaningful to see some system change holistically. And actually electing politicians who understand the scale of the challenge could have a multiplier effect on reducing emissions. And in the Conservative leadership election over the summer, our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, wasn't too clear on his commitment to net zero by 2050, which is already too late. And he actually offered some solutions that demonstrate a real lack of understanding to the scale of the challenge. And if climate change is going to impact the next generation, it's going to impact the most vulnerable around the world, then we need to be really careful about where our vote goes. Okay, there's my kind of plan. That's my pitch for you. I've seen another question come in. This is from Rich. He says, I'd be interested to know your views on conversations with climate skeptics. I had a conversation with a local councillor recently about this. The response was dismissive. One comment was, what's the point in doing anything when China are so bad? Well, I wonder where that comes from. What's the point in doing anything because China are so bad? I wonder what started that point of view. It comes up so often. It's so repeatable. Who's saying this? Is it in the Daily Mail? Is it on some telly I'm not watching? Is it Farage? Who's saying this? So yeah, how do we talk to climate skeptics? I actually think the majority of us in society aren't climate skeptics. They understand that there's an issue and that there's a lot that needs to be done. There are some people that would say, don't waste your time with climate skeptics because a lot of them are just there to argue. I don't think anyone's a lost cause necessarily. So I'd suggest that we need to listen. We need to listen to concerns and then talk through why it's the responsible and the right thing to do for us to take our own actions as well. So I had a bit of a conversation like that with a colleague at work who said something along the lines of, "Oh, Tom, this is all going to cost so much. Why do we need to do it in County Durham? It's China's fault. Why won't they do it first?" And my response comes in a few different ways. So first of all, in the UK, we were one of the first people to dig up coal and burn it on an industrial scale. One of the first, but not the only one. We then exported a lot of that technology all around the world with our glorious empire, and actually, yeah, and other countries overtook us in that. So the United States then started burning oil on an industrial scale, and yes, China and other big, huge countries have also burnt a lot as well. But I think as to take our responsibility for our share of emissions, which I think is on the verge of something like 1% of total emissions the UK is responsible for. I think we need to lead the way. So we're fifth or sixth wealthiest country. I think we need to lead the way. So that's my first response is that we burn stuff first. We probably need to lead the way first. And secondly, it's funny, this fixation with China. It's where a lot of the stuff that we manufacture or that we buy is manufactured. One of the ways that the UK has reduced emissions over the last 30 years is we've exported a lot of our industry. We don't make much stuff in the UK anymore. And where's that gone? That's gone to places that tend to have high emissions: China, India, Bangladesh, North Africa, Eastern Europe. We've been really happy to do that because we think it's been cheaper, or we think it means we can buy more, or we have less less dirty jobs potentially. But actually, we've just exported our emissions as well as exporting our manufacture. And so my second point would be, well, yeah, whose emissions really are the coal power station that's been built in China? Who's responsible for those emissions? Do we have any responsibility for them? And then the third point I'd say is that, a lot of the low carbon technology around the world is being manufactured in places like China. Most of the solar panels that will be on roofs in the UK are probably made in China, or have some supply chain that is linked to China. So, although this is really tough because there are multiple issues with the Chinese state, with the treatment of workers, with human rights, with the treatment of minorities. This isn't perfect, and we have some reliance in our global society on this country, in this industry that we're not that big a fan of. But when people say, "Oh, it's China's fault, they're emitting loads," actually they're probably one of the people that are one of the parts of the world that are going to help lead the way in reducing emissions, whether that is solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, or manufacturing the things that will help us reduce emissions. It would be fantastic to have more of that manufacturing locally, and I think when we think about industry in the UK that is currently high emissions, how do we move that industry away, and what opportunity is there to do more in the UK, whether that is wind turbine development or solar panel manufacture, battery manufacture, whatever it would be. But yeah, we're relying on that. And I think it's so easy to it's what, back to the original question, it's what aboutism, isn't it? It's not my problem because someone else is doing something bad. What's the example of that? I've got a gambling addiction, but he's got a much worse gambling addiction, so my addiction is fine. It's like this is crazy. So if every gram of CO2 counts, the 400 million tons of CO2 that the UK emitted count as much as 400 million emitted in China, and we need to do as much as we can to reduce them as quickly as possible. So, how do we respond to climate skeptics? I think we need to listen, and we need to have calm, patient conversations with them, and win them over with the argument, which is we're actually, this stuff is building a better society, cleaner air, cheaper energy, less reliance on global despots like Mr. Putin. This stuff is positive, and we can build a better society, as well as the Chinese doing what they need to do. A few more comments. So Gary's come back and said the China issue is interesting. China has a huge carbon footprint because they manufacture a lot of stuff for the West. One of the points I made. They also have the largest amount of solar installed anywhere in the world. Yeah, exactly. I think it's always said, they're building a coal power station every week. I'm not sure that's true anymore, but how much solar capacity and wind capacity adding each week, each day as well. And Rich has come back and said attribution is an interesting issue. Should it be with the manufacturer of the stuff or with the consumer? He knows his view. I think it should be with the consumer. If you've provoked some manufacturer, then they're your emissions. We talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 being the stuff that we burn directly, so that would be a gas in a gas boiler or petrol, diesel in a car. Scope 2 is the stuff that emits as we use it. So electricity tends to be scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 is the emissions linked to the things that we buy and things that we consume, which actually tend to be some of the higher emissions in this calculation. So tackling scope 3 from an organizational perspective can be very difficult. How do you get someone that you're buying a product from? Can you write into a contract that will only buy this product from you if you have a plan for net zero or whatever it needs to be? But that the scope 3 stuff is tricky. Cool. I've been going for an hour and 4 minutes because I started a little bit late. I've got time for lots more questions, Gary, if you've got some. But if there's anyone on here that's got any issues around or questions around specifics about how to decarbonize your home, or what steps we need to take, or what's the right thing to prioritize, then whatever I can do to help would be great. It's been an interesting conversation anyway. Some of the inputs from Lewis and Rich and Gary. Here's another one from Gary. What's your view on the highest priority where we need to focus money and efforts? Is it electrifying heat, more renewables, more EVs? So I think the big challenge that we've got in the UK to decarbonise is heat. So I think it's the first one. It's doing something to with heat, but partly because more renewables, more EVs. So more renewables is an investment that would attract finance without a priority. So a solar farm will be profitable in a time frame that a pension fund is really going to like. And a wind turbine similarly would be profitable in a time frame that financing will really find attractive. And actually, electric vehicles as well. If we can generate low cost electricity, then there's definitely a case financially for moving to per mile for moving to an EV. But also, I love it. I'm sure you've experienced this, Gary. But when people move from an old petrol or diesel car to get an electric vehicle the first time, people just have a smile on their face. It's just better. It's a better experience. The noise, the how quick and responsive they are, how comfortable you are without the subconscious thinking of changing gears, and the engine braking just makes so much sense, and all this stuff. They're just a better experience. They're a better product. So I think we're at a tipping point there. But what do we need to focus on? It's definitely heat for me. So if it's, I'm rounding up a little bit, but it's more or less 50% of our emissions in the UK is linked to heat, particularly in County Durham. It's 48% in County Durham. And although we have this solution, which is heat pumps, it is a costly solution. So the system that we had put in would have cost around £11,000 to do. So with the £5,000 boiler upgrade scheme, £6,000. It's not something that lots of people have lying around. But people spend that kind of money on putting a new kitchen in, or on doing up their garden, or on redecorating their house, or on a new snazzy set of sofas. So how do we make it fashionable to decarbonise our heat? That's a challenge for me. And there's potentially cost savings that could happen there as we learn more, as more installed. If 300,000 homes built each year were installing a heat pump, then there seems to be a cost saving for me there. So, I think at a household level and a personal level, focusing or prioritizing heat is a good one. So actually doing the hard work to insulate your home properly, really positive. And there are examples. I think I might do a series where I go and chat to friends around that have done some really good stuff. And there's some examples of people around us here that have done some really good stuff to reduce emissions linked to heat through insulating properly, through installing heat pumps, and doing other things as well. And so, what does it mean to really look at the detail and do the hard work of insulating your home properly, and then the hard work and potentially the disruption of getting a good heat pump installed? I think that should be a priority. And it's a big step change in our emissions as well. But could be awkward, could be difficult. Rich has come back and said, one thing I noticed is that almost all the time we use some gas in the grid. So at present, any increase in electricity demand increases gas usage. As we electrify, we increase use of gas. Interesting. We need to increase the percentage of renewables contributing to the grid. Yeah, that's spot on. And I guess you're talking about the marginal capacity or the marginal generator on the grid there. Then every next kilowatt of demand tends to be met by a gas power station or a coal power station. Yes, you're right. And we need to have more renewable energy on the grid so that we can take away some of that gas demand. it's interesting living in somewhere like the northeast. You can get quite into the geekery of the data of the electricity grid if you wanted to. And one of the ways that's really accessible is through the National Grid Energy System Operator, or National Grid ESO, who has a website and app and all this kind of stuff, which plots the emissions of the grid across the whole country. So it does things. It has a map where it says that this is the demand and the emissions, or the carbon intensity of the grid in this region. And actually in the northeast, it tends to be quite low. And that's because we've got a nuclear power station at Hartlepool. It's because we have some offshore wind nearby. We have some onshore wind, and because we don't have that much demand. So we're probably exporting our energy to the regions around us. So yeah, the carbon intensity of the grid in County Durham tends to be, I've seen it, 9 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, whereas on the average across the UK, we're around 200, 210, 220 grams of CO2. But then you look at in the Midlands across that central belt, where we still have coal power stations, we have a lot of gas power stations, the emissions are quite high. So I like to think that using more electricity in County Durham means I'm getting lower carbon electricity than if someone used more elsewhere. But yeah, we need to work hard to reduce emissions linked to electricity. As I said earlier, I think it's going to do it on its own. I think there's enough finance and there's enough payback for that to happen on its own, and we can get there fairly quickly. It'll be great to have a very low carbon grid by 2030. Have less than 100 grams of CO2 on average throughout a year. That would be a fantastic step, and it would mean that electric vehicles are very low carbon. I mean, heat pumps are even lower carbon, and yeah, as it continues to get to go further. And I understand that the plans by 2035 are to be under 10 grams of CO2 by 2035. When we're at that stage, if we've electrified everything, we have a very, very, very low carbon energy system, and that'll be very positive. Right. Any final questions? I hope that's been interesting and useful. I've done it basically because my wife's away and she took the dog with her, so I don't have much else to do. I wasn't that interested in watching the World Cup tonight. So I thought, you know what, let's do a live stream. Let's do a bit of an experiment to see if anyone would tune in. It's been fun to chat things through. I hope my 5-point plan to reduce emissions was helpful. And I obviously would love to carry on this conversation. So please do check out the rest of the YouTube channel. Please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, all that kind of stuff, and get in touch if there's anything that you want to comment on, that you disagree with, or that you want to ask us a question. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully see you soon. I'm going to call it a day there.